It is a Sunday night in March 2026. Two families are sitting in two different living rooms somewhere in Middle America. In the first house, the television is on. The father is scrolling through his phone while the news runs footage of oil tankers rerouting away from the Strait of Hormuz. His wife asks if they should move everything in the 401k to cash. He has no answer. He opened his brokerage app 3 times today and watched the number drop each time. They filled up the minivan yesterday at $3.71 a gallon, which is almost 30 cents more than it cost just a few weeks ago. He is thinking about pulling the kids out of their summer camp because who knows what gas will cost by June. Everything feels like it is accelerating towards something terrible, and the only instinct that makes sense is to stock everything, sell everything, and sit on cash until the world calms down. In the second house, things are quieter. Not because these parents are wealthier or smarter or less worried. They see the same headlines. They felt the same stain at the pump. But this family has a system. They reviewed their budget when Brent crude crossed $80 a barrel in early March. They checked the allocation inside their retirement accounts, not to sell, but to make sure they were not accidentally overweight in one sector. They topped off their emergency fund because they knew that energy shocks have a way of bleeding into groceries, into shipping costs, into everything. And then they did the hardest thing in personal finance during uncertain times. They did nothing dramatic. They stayed the course. This video is about the difference between those two families, not their income, not their luck, their information. As a family guy, I spend a lot of time thinking about the things I can and cannot control. I cannot control what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. I cannot control the price of Brent crude, which, as of this past week, has been hovering around $100 a barrel after starting the month near 68. That is roughly a $30 jump in the span of weeks. I cannot control the fact that the disruption to that single waterway has effectively choked off around 20% of the world's daily oil supply. What I can control is how I respond to it, and more importantly, how I let it affect the financial plan my family depends on. Here is the thing about war and money that almost nobody on television will explain calmly. Conflict creates a fog, not just on the battlefield, but in finance. When bombs start falling and oil prices start spiking and the S&P 500 drops a couple hundred points in a week, the loudest voices rush to the microphone. They tell you the sky is falling. They tell you to buy gold, sell stocks, hoard cash, fill your bathtub with gasoline. I am exaggerating, but not by much. And the data, going back over 100 years of American market history, consistently shows that the loudest voices during a crisis are almost always the worst ones to follow when it comes to your wallet. Let me explain what is actually happening right now mechanically, so we can strip away the emotion and look at the engine underneath. The conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran has disrupted traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. That strait is roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and every single day before this conflict, approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products flowed through it. When that flow gets interrupted, it does not just raise the price of oil. It starts a chain reaction. Analysts call it the oil inflation loop, and it goes something like this. Oil prices rise, which increases the cost of shipping goods everywhere. That shipping cost gets passed to manufacturers, who pass it to wholesalers, who pass it to the grocery store. who passes it to you standing in aisle 6 wondering why a dozen eggs costs more than it did 3 weeks ago. The USDA already projected that food prices would rise about 3% in 2026. That estimate was made before the worst of the Hormuz disruption. For a family of 4, spending around $1,500 a month on groceries under the USDA moderate cost plan, an additional percentage point or two of food inflation is not abstract. That is an extra $20 to $30 a month that just evaporates from the budget. Combine that with gas going from roughly $3 to $3.70 a gallon, and a family with 2 cars commuting to work is spending an extra $50 to $70 a month just on fuel. These are not catastrophic numbers in isolation, but they are the kind of slow, compounding pressure that makes people feel like the ground is shifting under their feet. And that feeling is exactly where the danger lies. Not in the price of gas itself, but in what the fear of rising prices makes people do with the rest of their money. There is a concept in behavioral economics, sometimes called crisis bias. It describes the tendency of the human brain, when it perceives a threat to the triad, to prioritize immediate, dramatic action over patient, strategic thinking. Tens of thousands of years ago, this instinct saved our lives. If the bush whistled, you ran first and asked questions later. But in a modern financial system, that instinct is a disaster. When the market drops 3% and the news shows burning oil fields and your neighbor tells you he moved his entire 401k into bonds, the bush rustling part of your brain screams at you to do the same thing. Run, sell, get out. And the data, every single time, shows that the people who listen to that instinct during geopolitical crises end up worse off than the people who do not. If we look at the data from the last century, the pattern is remarkably consistent. During the 1990 Gulf War, oil surged roughly 135%, going from about $17 a barrel to $46 in 90 days. The S&P 500 fell around 16%. It felt apocalyptic at the time. People were convinced the economy was finished. And yet, the market fully recovered within 6 months of the initial drop and ended 1991 significantly higher, rebounding 26 to 29% once the conflict wound down and crude collapsed. Research from LPL Financial shows that the average S&P 500 drawdown after major geopolitical events is just 4.6%, and stocks typically recover within weeks to months. The S&P 500 rose during 9 out of 11 wars since 1939. Not because war is good for the economy, it is not, but because the American market has an almost stubborn tendency to price in the shock, absorb it, and move forward. The 2022 Ukraine crisis saw a similar pattern. Oil spiked, the market wobbled, fear dominated headlines for months, and over the following year, the S&P climbed 48%. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not saying that this time is guaranteed to play out exactly the same way. The Hormuz disruption is more severe than anything we have seen in decades, and the IEA's decision to release 400 million barrels from strategic reserves, the largest coordinated release in its history, tells you that serious people are taking this seriously. The Consumer Sentiment Index just fell to 55.5 in March, the lowest reading of 2026, and CNBC analysts are now projecting that if energy disruptions persist, CPI inflation could rise to 3.5% by year-end, up from the current 2.4%. These are real numbers with real consequences. What I am saying is that the historical record gives us a framework for how to think about this, and that framework does not include panic selling your retirement fund. For those of us with a mortgage, a car payment, and kids who need to eat 3 times a day, the question is not whether the war will end or when oil will come back down. The question is, what do I do with the things I can actually touch? And that is where I want to introduce what I call war-proofing, not in the survivalist bunker in the backyard sense, in the boring, responsible spreadsheet on the kitchen table sense. This week, the single most impactful thing any family can do is audit discretionary spending in light of rising energy prices. I know that sounds simple, almost too simple for a moment that feels this dramatic, but if gas is costing your family an extra $50 to $70 a month and groceries are creeping up, that money has to come from somewhere. Look at subscriptions. Look at dining out. Look at the impulse purchases that sneak through when you are stressed and just want to feel normal. I am not talking about austerity. I am talking about awareness. When you know exactly where your money is going during a price shock, you buy yourself something more valuable than any stock pick. You buy yourself time. Time to think. Time to avoid making a decision out of fear. This month, take 30 minutes and open your 401k or your IRA. Do not open it to check the balance. Open it to check the allocation. Many people who set up their retirement accounts years ago have never rebalanced. That means you might be significantly overweight in sectors that are getting hammered by the current volatility or underweight in areas that tend to hold up during energy shocks. You are not trying to time the market. You are trying to make sure your long-term plan still reflects your actual risk tolerance. If looking at a 10% drop makes you physically sick, you might need a slightly more conservative allocation, and that is perfectly fine. The worst thing you can do is have an aggressive portfolio and a conservative stomach, because that mismatch is what leads to panic selling at the bottom. Over the course of this year, the goal is to increase what I call the safety margin in the family budget. That means growing the emergency fund, even if it is just by a little bit each month. Before the conflict, the general rule was 3 to 6 months of expenses. In an environment where energy prices are volatile and inflation forecasts are being revised upward, I think pushing toward the higher end of that range makes sense. It also means being honest about big purchases. If you are planning to buy a new car or renovate the kitchen, it might be worth waiting 90 days to see how the energy picture develops. Not because the world is ending, because patience is free and debt during inflation is expensive. I want to come back to those two families from the beginning. The father in the first house, the one doom scrolling through his phone, is not a bad person, and he is not unintelligent. He is scared. And fear is the most expensive emotion in personal finance. If he panic sold his 401k in the second week of March when the S&P was around 5,600, and the market recovers over the next 12 months the way it has after virtually every geopolitical shock in modern history, he will have locked in his losses at the worst possible moment. He will have turned a temporary paper decline into a permanent, real one. And the recovery, when it comes, will happen without him. The family in the second house is not fearless. They are just prepared. They have a budget that accounts for price swings. They have an emergency fund that lets them absorb a bad month without touching their investments. They have a retirement allocation that matches their actual ability to stomach volatility. And they have something that no news broadcast can provide, which is a long-term perspective grounded in data rather than headlines. When you are trying to explain the world to your kids, And they ask why gas costs more or why the news looks so scary. I think the most honest thing you can tell them is that difficult things happen in the world, and our job is not to predict them or prevent them, but to be ready for them. That is true for life, and it is true for money. The Strait of Hormuz will eventually reopen to normal traffic. Oil prices will eventually stabilize. The S&P 500 will eventually find its footing. I do not know if that happens in 3 weeks, or 3 months, or 9 months. Nobody does, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What I do know is that every family that came out the other side of the 1973 oil embargo, the 1990 Gulf War, the 2008 financial crisis, and the 2022 energy shock had one thing in common. They did not let the worst week of the news cycle become the worst financial decision of their lives. As a family guy, that is the only strategy I trust. Not because it is exciting, because it works. And right now, in March 2026, boring and disciplined is the most radical thing you can be.